Hey guys, a very good day to you and welcome to the Holy Shed, the littlest parish in Christendom, where all is well. All manner of things are well, you might say, and I hope all is well with you too. Now, that said, the news in the past week or two hasn't been too well, has it? Pretty awful, actually, unbearable, especially the earthquake in Morocco and the floods in Libya with the appalling loss of life, destruction of communities, and so on and so forth. I think there's a psychological numbness that comes over most of us, comes over me, certainly, when we struggle with the sheer awfulness of events that are going on in the world like they are at the moment. Sometimes I think we just need to take a bit of a break from the news for our own sanity's sake. Not to bury our heads in the sand, that's not a good thing, but to avoid being overwhelmed by things that essentially we can do precious little about other than pray and hold these poor people and situations in our hearts. However, one of the added dimensions of sorrow and frustration for me as I've watched the news has been hearing dear people who have lost so much, almost compliantly speaking of their loss in terms of God's will. Like the man, you might have seen him, who through bitter tears of anguish sobbed that God had taken his children's life. God gave it and God took it away, he said. Now, the last thing these kinds of people need is theological blah blah from someone like me. However, I would dearly love to wrap them in my arms and somehow or other convey, dear friend, this is not the will of God. God does not want to take your children. God does not arbitrarily create disasters or will suffering or death in the world. But of course, such perceptions are deeply embedded in the psyche of many of us. And in a weird way, it's how for centuries many people of different religious traditions have kind of made sense of the universe with its ebb and flow of beautiful life on the one hand and heartless tragedy on the other. And yet for anyone who ponders the issue a little bit more, there is an unbearable, impossible dilemma which theologians and philosophers speak of as the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. The 18th century skeptic and philosopher David Hume posed the question like this. He said, is God impotent? Is he able but not willing? If so, he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? How can any honest person of faith not wrestle with this issue, especially when evil or suffering strikes close to home? You know, how to reconcile an all-powerful, all-loving God with diabolical events and suffering. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, and countless atrocities of totalitarianism, plus the dilemma of natural disasters, some of which trace back to human interventions, but not all of them, plus the whole raft of personal tragedies resulting from accidents or disease or whatever. All of this tells us there's no simple answer to this. And the last thing that people in the midst of it need is someone coming along with their own clever clog's answer to it all. I often feel when I'm sitting with people in pain and suffering or loss that silence is the best gift that I can give to someone. Silent presence, that is. And for many people, there really is a religious dimension to this dilemma to do with how we picture and understand God in the midst of pain and suffering. What sort of God allows, or worse still, wills such things? Well, I've already said that I don't believe for one moment that God wills pain and suffering in the world. But I'm not going to address that whole issue right now. It's a biggie and we need to talk about it. and I will come back to it. But for now, I want to stick with this subject of how we perceive God. Where do our perceptions of God come from? Can they change? And if so, how? The plain fact is, there are many, many different pictures, images, and ideas about God and what God's like. Not just between different religions, but within particular religions too. And, frankly, when I sometimes hear Christians speaking about God, preaching about God, or describing God in different ways, it makes me want to scream. I do not believe that. I cannot believe in a God who is like that. By the way, this theme of what God is like is absolutely central to what I'm currently writing, the book that I'm starting to get my head around, because it's clear to me that hordes and hordes of people, hordes of good people, walk away from God and from religion basically because they can't accept it. They can't relate to what they see or what they hear about God in an awful lot of religion. I actually intend to couch this issue in provocative slash humorous language of God is an atheist, because I think God is so different to the way many people perceive God, and I don't think God believes in that God. As I've said many times, just about invariably, the God I hear atheists say they don't believe in, I, and I'm sure you too, do not believe in. So, from that perspective, we ourselves are atheists, and I'm happy to stand up to own that. And interestingly, early Christians and Jews too were accused of being atheists because they rejected the conventional Roman gods of the time. And there are gods of this time, even in my own Christian faith, that I have to reject, even if that means that some people think I am virtually an atheist. I would even argue, that atheism, that sort of, bogeyman word, that atheism might be seen at times as a gift from God. It's a necessary acid bath to, purge naive assumptions and superstitions, to deconstruct images of the divine, which are either just outmoded and outdated, or which perhaps are even harmful or dangerous and misleading. When, for example, I read The God Argument by the humanist, where is it? Here it is. Got the very book here. When I read this book, The God Argument by A.C. Grayling, and the description of religion, which in the first half of the book he derides, well, I just read it and say, hey man, I don't disagree with any of what you've said. That God I do not believe in. And then in the second part of the book, he's got a section that he calls an alternative to religion. And, I could just take the whole lot pretty much. I embrace it because as I've said before, I don't think there is any inherent conflict between being both a Christian and a humanist. And more about that perhaps sometime. And on a similar line, when I watched, you may have seen it too, Simon Fry's devastating demolition of God's stuff. It's there on YouTube still, I think. When I watched that, I felt so sad that his experience and his understanding of God and religion is so alien to everything that I believe and understand about God and which I live with, on a daily basis. And yet I completely appreciate his honest and penetrating and deeply uncomfortable questioning of a lot of conventional religious assumptions. Because, in many ways, he absolutely hits the nail on the head on issues that I've had so many weak and pathetic responses to by Christians that just don't, they don't go anywhere near to convincing me, let alone someone like Stephen Fry. And really, this is what motivates me to write any book, but to write this book, which I'm writing at the moment. I mean, imagine for a moment going into a restaurant, okay? You're hungry and you fancy something to eat. But when the waiter comes and hands you the menu, you just see lists of bland, unappetizing food that you just can't imagine ordering any of them, much less paying good money for them. So, you get up and you leave, you get on with your life. Maybe pop into a corner shop if you're me and buy a bag of crisps and a Kit Kat instead. But I think this is how actually a lot of people feel about religion, especially when they go into many a church. But just generally, there's nothing really tempting on the menu, and that explains why so few people come to church and why so many people now do not sign up, even in a nominal sense, to saying they're Christian. They'd much rather tick the non's box because, the menu is bare for them. There's nothing they feel will satisfy the hunger, which they do have. Spiritual hunger is very, very alive and well out there. I mean, some of the things they find on the menu are not just bland, but completely off-putting. So, yeah, they up and off to find something somewhere else, far, far away from organized religion. Well, what I'm wanting to do is rewrite the menu. That's basically what I'm doing in writing this book. And whenever I have the opportunity, as I have had over decades now, to offer people a different menu, at a wedding, say, or a funeral, or the baptism of a child, or special services at Christmas, Easter, or whenever it is that people, come within the sphere of my influence and voice, and I've offered what I feel to be a different menu, I have found that people are so often up for it and are very grateful for it. I've had people say to me, if this was heard more in churches, I think I and a lot more people would be there. And it's just not that people reject God out of hand. They just don't like the menu. They haven't encountered God through the religious framework in a liberating, life-affirming, l'chaim kind of way. And so instinctively, they just know inside, this is not it. This is not it. This is not what I'm looking for. The trouble with God is, if I can put it that way, no one has actually seen God or encountered God face to face, as it were. I know some people claim it, but that's nonsense. No one can literally describe God. There are no photographs or, portraits that were modelled by God, him or herself. So how can we say anything about God? That's if you like, the trouble with God. How do we say anything about God? Well, I think there are two routes that we might take toward this. The first one is the route of what you could broadly call theology. Theology which is essentially, based on and connected with scripture, with tradition, the whole line of conversation within the Christian tradition, and human reasoning. This is the three-legged stool that we speak about in Anglicanism, of scripture, tradition, and reason. And that's one absolutely essential route. It's the route that I most of my life I'm taking that route. It is, we must say, intrinsically metaphorical or analogical. In other words, it's about describing God by likening God to something else, which is part of human experience and language. So we understand that. And that's the only way in which, really, from a theological point of view, from a rational point of view, we can speak of God, by analogy or by metaphor, by speaking of God in likeness to something that we're already familiar with. So, for instance, we might say that God is our Father in heaven. Or if you're trendy like me, you might say our Mother in heaven. But God, of course, isn't literally our Father or Mother. There is no literal divine genitalia, no divine womb or whatever like that. And this is why we can only say that God is kind of like this, but we immediately have to say, and kind of not. It's an is and an is not. It's a yay and a nay. And that's the nature of metaphorical language all the time. Because whenever we liken something to something else, we can say it's like that, but it also isn't like that. And this is especially true when we come into the realm of theology and we're talking about God. There's always got to be that tension of is and is not. And as soon as the is not is lost, then it ceases to be a metaphor and it is said it is purporting to be a fact. Okay? So that tension is absolutely essential. But once we acknowledge this, once we acknowledge the analogical nature of God talk, the great thing is we can then look at metaphors for what they are. We can critique the metaphors because they are a human device. We can explore what may or may not be helpful. What's more helpful, what's less helpful, what might have been helpful in the past, but not so much today. It's kind of outworn its usefulness. It's a bit threadbare now, even though it may have been useful at one time. Personally, I find the whole image of God as Lord pretty unhelpful and King not much better. In the prayer book that I'm putting together, prayers that I've shared here week in, week out in the shed, in the introduction to that, I have said that I just find that liturgy in church is just too lordy. There's Lord, 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 Lord everywhere. And what the heck does it mean? And in today's world, the world I live in, it doesn't actually necessarily convey the best thing. Now, if we've lived with it all our lives, we take it for granted. But when you start putting that out there into a wider world, it says something different. The metaphor speaks differently and becomes, for many people, less helpful, as I say, is with King. I really like Sally McFaig's redescription of God as mother, lover, and friend. And she says that in an ecological age, we need to shift away from the kind of metaphors, the monarchical metaphors, and the patriarchal metaphors. And she puts forward as an experiment, and that's what it is. We're not saying it's not that, it's this, but we're saying that is now less helpful, but how about exploring this? And I wonder how it would be for you. I know I've experimented with it, exploring the idea of God as mother, lover, and friend. And the great power of a metaphor is that it redescribes something, and in the course of that opens up a new reality. So reality actually shifts with a shift of metaphor. But the point is, once we know that we're dealing with metaphors and not actuality, we can exercise constructive critical thinking to the whole matter. I mean, a side point here, metaphors can be active and powerful and helpful, or they can be dormant and become more like cliches, and they're not kind of functioning anymore. And they can also be taken for granted, so that they cease to operate as metaphors and become mistaken for literal reality. And this is what's happened with a lot of religious metaphorical language, so that when people often in church don't even recognize that they're dealing with a metaphor, that we speak about God in terms of Lord, and that's how it is. So while few people would defend the idea of God being literally male, for instance, most people, if you actually put that to them, would say, well, no, of course God's not literally male. All we need to do is, in that context, is suggest that we perhaps change it, that we sometimes mix it up and maybe refer to God with female language or use feminine pronouns. And you know what? Suddenly you discover that God is actually thought of as male. You see what I mean? It's once you sort of, people are, they're very happy to sort of say, in principle, of course, that's true. But if in practice you say, well, let's change our liturgy, not necessarily entirely from male to female, but let's just mix it up. That becomes problematic. So, I mean, regardless of what people do or don't believe, when most people, religious people or atheists actually, say the word God, what they're actually referring to is a metaphor, i.e., God is a big, powerful person. So what they then profess to believe in or disbelieve in is actually a metaphor, which I think is a really bad metaphor in the first place, actually. But you know, it is a metaphor. So what we end up arguing about, believing and not believing, isn't actually God. It's a metaphor. It's notions of God put forward in analogical or metaphorical form. I think it's a really healthy thing when we can recognize and acknowledge the metaphorical or analogical nature of our God talk, partly because recognizing that that's it can help us to avoid slipping unwittingly into a kind of idolatry. And trust me, worshipping the maleness of God and refusing to have anything other than that is a kind of idolatry, which has had real consequences, because once we say God is male, it's a very short step to a hidden assumption that male is God, or that maleness is more godlike, or that maleness equals headship or priority in some kind of order of God. Now that really is idolatry, and yet it's very prevalent, I find, amongst certain people in the church. But acknowledging metaphorical language can also help to keep our understanding of and our relationship to God alive and vibrant and renewed for new cultural and historical situations. I'm going to say more about that as we go on in future Holy Sheds. But I think that's, you know, really important that, as I say, a metaphor changes the reality. And that means that finding a metaphor that is more pertinent, more relative, more vibrant, can help to renew our own relationship to the divine, to God, in a new cultural situation. But the second way that we are able to say anything meaningful about God, I've been talking about how we do it in theology, and that is inherently metaphorical. But there's a second way that we can say anything meaningful about God, and this is through going down the mystical route, or the route of direct experience, which isn't about words and concepts and beliefs and ideas and metaphors and all of that kind of stuff. You know, based on a vision of God being present everywhere, in every part of creation, we can become open to connecting with God all over the place in everyday life in a way that doesn't require theology and words and metaphors. It's a more direct experience. Now, mystical, I should say, doesn't mean, you know, having creepy experiences or visions of angels floating around the place or singing Handel's Messiah in the middle of the night. That's not what I'm talking about. Mystical means something far more mundane, actually, than all of that. I think that we all have mystical experiences. We all have little epiphanies, aha moments, flashes of wonder or inspiration or longing that help us to find a sparkle in life, to look at life, the world, and ourselves in different ways. And I think we can put ourselves in the way of those experiences. Sometimes they just happen, you know, you just kind of look out over a field or whatever, or over a crowd of people. I've done it actually at a football match, where you just sort of look out at these people, or you hear them singing, You'll Never Walk Alone, or whatever, and somehow you suddenly feel this sort of sense of oneness with everything. There's this flash of something that you can't entirely put into words. Now, as I say, that sometimes it just overtakes us like that, but we can actually, through, you know, put ourselves directly in line for it. And that's really what mindfulness is all about, using the language of a different tradition. It's that sense of bringing ourselves into the moment, bringing ourselves into this situation, and opening ourselves up to just what is there here and now. And guess what? What's here and now is God, is the divine. So these are mystical or direct experiences of the divine, and they can help us to reimagine and to reconnect with God, to bump into God unexpectedly, just anywhere and everywhere. So back to metaphors and analogies of God. I mentioned being able to approach them with constructive criticism to judge which are more or less helpful to us. I'm going to talk about this more in future sheds, but in broad brushstrokes, let me say this. I think that images of God which are most helpful are those that help us to explore, helpful for us to explore, are those which convey love and compassion, which convey a strength which is not an overpowering strength, which convey freedom or inclusion, which is just another word for grace. Images that help me to feel a deep interconnectedness with the creation, with other people, as members of God's universal family. There's so much more to say about these things, but my point is that metaphors can be like volcanoes, metaphorically speaking. Volcanoes, they can be alive and active and still cooking. Metaphors can be. Or they can become dormant cliches, haven't really erupted much for a long, long time, and they just become a cliche. All the fire is extinguished. Or they can be suspended because they now are mistaken for reality, for literal fact. So they've ceased to be a metaphor anymore. So there's today's message, guys. Let's keep our metaphors cooking by constantly finding fresh analogies, or by reinvesting in some old ones and finding that they can be revivified, renewed, come back to life in a new and fresh form. I'm very excited about all this, and I'm excited to write about it. I'm excited to talk about it here with you guys, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas, and especially metaphors that you have found helpful, perhaps new metaphors, new images of God that you've stumbled on, or which you've thought your way into. I'd love to hear about those, and that'd be really helpful to me. So now here is a prayer. God beyond all notions of God, filling the universe, yet appearing in the tiny body of a dormouse, in the faithful presence of an oak. Open my eyes to the mundane fellowship of creation that holds me unostentatiously in the sustaining power of your love. Open my ears to the music of a billion atoms chorusing me through each day. Open my heart to a love that will not let me go, ever, and a presence that shadows my every move, closer than breath, faithful as a friend. Amen. Okay, well, just time for a quick toast. If you've got a drink, whatever it be, you could do one for me and pass it to me, but maybe we're not up there with technology yet. But if you've got a drink, whatever it is, I invite you to take a hold of it now. And I think before a toast, I just hold this drink as a prayer for people, dear ones in Morocco and Libya, elsewhere too, of course, but we're thinking about the devastation that has suddenly befallen the people in these two countries and the awful, awful pain that is unimaginable to us. Let's send a prayer, send some love out to those people. But a toast, A toast to finding God in a wonderful oak tree or a tiny dormouse or your own lovely little animals and creatures that you have in your life. A toast to metaphors. I don't think I've ever proposed a toast to a metaphor before, but a toast to metaphors, especially lovely living images that help us to envisage God and life more joyfully and more liberally. A toast to life, L'chaim. Well, that's it for this week, guys. Thank you very much for being with me here in the Holy Shed. If you like what I'm doing, hey, you can buy me a coffee. You can support us. You just have to follow the link on the screen. It's also always at the top of the Holy Shed Facebook page. And we're deeply grateful for all the support that you give us like this and in other ways too. And yeah, I think that's kind of about it, really. Well, I'll tell you what, here is a blessing. In happy times, may you be grateful. In challenging times, may you be brave. In tedious times, may you find joy in the moment. And at all times, may you be assured that you are God's dearly beloved. Amen. And that's it. I'm going to finish with a poem, actually, a lovely poem by Edwina Gately. And it's called Be Glad. And it kind of hits the nail on the head with things that we've been talking about here. So thanks for being with me. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Meanwhile, tread softly in the world. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to people around you. Stay human. And I'll see you soon. Here's the poem. Here it is. Be glad. God is soaked in our world. God's Spirit lives and breathes in and through all that is. We are lost only when we do not understand that God is already with and in each one of us. Our task is recognition of God's initiative to be at home in us, acceptance of God with us, that we cannot but be glad. Thank you, Edwina. Have a good week, guys. See you soon.